Marcus Williams turned his pickup truck onto Oakwood Drive and felt his heart skip a beat. After 25 years of moving from base to base, sleeping in tents and living in temporary housing, he was finally coming home. Not just to any home, but to his dream home in Willowbrook, one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. He drove slowly down the tree-lined street, taking in every detail. The houses were beautiful. Each one sat on a large lot with perfectly cut grass and colorful flowers. The sidewalks were clean and smooth. Street lamps stood like soldiers in a neat row. Everything looked peaceful and well cared for. Marcus had dreamed of this moment for years. During his 3 tours overseas, when the desert heat made it hard to breathe and the sound of helicopters filled the air, he would close his eyes and picture himself in a place just like this, a quiet street where children could ride bikes safely, a place where he could sit on his front porch and watch the sunset without worrying about danger. He pulled into the driveway of 1247 Oakwood Drive and turned off the engine. For a moment, he just sat there looking at the house that was now his. It was a 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters. A large oak tree shaded the front yard. The previous owners had planted roses by the front steps and they were blooming bright red. Marcus stepped out of his truck and stretched. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and strong hands. At 52, his hair was starting to turn gray at the temples, but his dark eyes were still sharp and alert. He moved with the straight posture of someone who had spent decades in the military. The morning air was fresh and cool. Birds were singing in the trees. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower hummed quietly. Marcus took a deep breath and smiled. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he decided to retire from the Army. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the moving company, telling him they would arrive in 30 minutes. Marcus looked at his watch. Perfect timing. He had planned everything down to the minute, just like he did when he was Colonel Williams, leading troops and making sure missions went smoothly. Marcus walked up to his front door and used his new keys for the first time. The lock turned easily and the door swung open. He stepped inside and looked around the empty rooms. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making bright squares on the hardwood floors. The house smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. He had bought the house fully furnished, so some furniture was already in place. A comfortable-looking sofa sat in the living room. The kitchen had modern appliances and granite counters. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet that was bigger than some of the places he had lived during his military career. Marcus walked from room to room, making mental notes about where he would put his things. He didn't have much furniture of his own. Military life had taught him to live simply and not get attached to too many possessions. But he did have some important items coming with the movers. His medals and certificates were carefully packed in a special box. He had photos of his fellow soldiers and the places he had served. There were books he had collected over the years and a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to his parents. As he explored his new home, Marcus thought about his journey to this moment. He had grown up in a small town where not many people had much money. His parents had worked hard to give him and his sister a good life. They had always taught him to treat people with respect and to work hard for what he wanted. When Marcus graduated from high school, he wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life. College seemed expensive and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Then a military recruiter came to his school and talked about opportunities in the Army. The recruiter spoke about seeing the world, learning skills, and serving something bigger than yourself. Marcus decided to enlist. He thought he might stay for a few years, learn a trade, and then come back home. But the military became more than just a job for him. It became his calling. He discovered he was good at leading people and making tough decisions. He cared about the soldiers under his command and worked hard to bring them home safely. Over the years, Marcus was promoted again and again. He went from private to sergeant to lieutenant to captain and finally to colonel. Each promotion came with more responsibility and more challenges. He served in different countries and saw things that changed him. He learned that freedom wasn't free and that some things were worth fighting for. But military life wasn't easy. Marcus had missed birthdays and holidays. He had said goodbye to friends who didn't come home. He had made decisions that kept him awake at night. The hardest part was being alone. He had been married once, briefly, but his wife couldn't handle the long separations and constant moves. They divorced after 3 years, and Marcus threw himself even deeper into his military career. Now, at 52, Marcus was ready for a different kind of life. He wanted to be part of a community. He wanted to know his neighbors' names and watch their children grow up. He wanted to plant a garden and see it bloom year after year. He wanted to find peace after decades of war. A large truck rumbled down the street, interrupting his thoughts. Marcus looked out the window and saw the moving van turning into his driveway. Right on time. He grabbed his keys and headed outside to meet the movers. The truck was huge, with city-wide moving painted on the side in large blue letters. The driver, a middle-aged man with a friendly face, climbed down from the cab and walked over to Marcus. "You Mr. Williams?" the driver asked, checking his clipboard. "That's me," Marcus replied, shaking the man's hand. "I'm Joe and this is my crew," the driver said, pointing to two younger men who were already opening the back of the truck. "We've got your stuff from the storage unit, plus the items you shipped from your last base. Should have you all set up by this evening." Marcus nodded. He had hired this company because they specialized in military moves. They understood that soldiers' belongings were precious, especially the items that represented years of service and sacrifice. As the movers began unloading boxes and furniture, Marcus felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was really happening. After all these years, he was finally putting down roots. He was home. Across the street from Marcus Williams' new home, Patricia Henderson stood at her living room window, watching every move through her lace curtains. She had been the unofficial watchdog of Willowbrook neighborhood for the past 15 years, and nothing happened on Oakwood Drive without her knowing about it. Patricia was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair that she kept perfectly styled. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy blue pants, even though it was Saturday morning. Everything about Patricia was neat and organized, from her spotless house to her perfectly manicured lawn. She took pride in maintaining standards, and she expected everyone else in the neighborhood to do the same. When the moving truck had rumbled down their quiet street, Patricia had immediately gone to her window to investigate. She had known that the house at 1247 was for sale, and she had been curious about who would buy it. The previous owners, the Johnsons, had been a nice elderly couple who kept to themselves and never caused any trouble. Patricia had hoped the new owners would be similar, but as she watched the scene unfold across the street, Patricia felt her concern growing. The new resident was a black man who appeared to be in his 50s. He was tall and muscular, and something about his confident way of moving made Patricia uncomfortable. She had lived in Willowbrook for 15 years, and the neighborhood had always been mostly white and very quiet. Change made her nervous. Patricia picked up her phone and called her friend Margaret, who lived 2 streets over. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Did you see the moving truck on Oakwood Drive?" Patricia asked without saying hello. "No, I didn't. What's happening?" Margaret replied. "We have a new neighbor, a black man. He's moving into the Johnson place," Patricia said, her voice tight with worry. "Well, that's nice. Maybe he'll be a good neighbor," Margaret said. Patricia frowned. Margaret was always too trusting, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Patricia knew that neighborhoods could change quickly if you weren't careful about who moved in. "I don't know about that," Patricia said. "He's got a big truck and there's a lot of noise. This is supposed to be a quiet family neighborhood." After hanging up with Margaret, Patricia continued her watch. She noticed that the new neighbor was dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt. To Patricia, this seemed disrespectful. When she had moved into Willowbrook, she had dressed nicely to make a good first impression on her neighbors. This man seemed to care nothing about appearances. Patricia also noticed that he was directing the movers with hand gestures and seemed to be in charge of the operation. She found his take-charge attitude concerning. In her experience, men who acted like they owned the place often caused problems later. As the morning wore on, Patricia found more things to worry about. The moving truck was large and was partially blocking the street. Cars had to slow down and drive around it. Patricia was sure this was against neighborhood rules. She made a mental note to check the homeowner association guidelines about moving trucks. She also noticed that the movers were playing music from a radio. It wasn't loud, but Patricia could hear it from her house. The music sounded like rap or hip-hop, which Patricia didn't like. She preferred classical music or maybe soft rock. This music felt aggressive and out of place in their peaceful neighborhood. Patricia decided to call her friend Linda, who was the current president of the Willowbrook Homeowner Association. Linda would want to know about the potential problems developing across the street. "Linda, this is Patricia. I'm calling about the new resident on Oakwood Drive. Oh, someone finally bought the Johnson house? That's wonderful news, Linda said cheerfully. Well, I'm not so sure about that, Patricia replied. There are already issues. The moving truck is blocking traffic. They're playing loud music and the new owner seems to have an attitude problem. What do you mean by attitude problem? Linda asked. Patricia struggled to put her feelings into words without sounding prejudiced. She knew she couldn't just say that she didn't like having a black neighbor, even though that's what was really bothering her. He just seems very aggressive and commanding. He's telling everyone what to do and acting like he owns the whole street. I'm worried about what kind of neighbor he's going to be. Linda was quiet for a moment. Patricia, maybe we should give him a chance. Moving day is stressful for everyone. Maybe once he's settled in, things will calm down. But Patricia wasn't satisfied with Linda's response. She felt like no one was taking her concerns seriously. In her mind, she was the only one who cared enough to pay attention to what was happening in their neighborhood. After lunch, Patricia noticed that the new neighbor had come outside and was sitting on his front steps, drinking from a water bottle. To Patricia, this looked like loitering. Why was he just sitting there? What was he watching? Was he looking at the other houses on the street? Was he planning something? Patricia's imagination began to run wild. She had heard stories on the news about people who moved into nice neighborhoods and then caused property values to drop. She had heard about break-ins and crime rates going up when the wrong kind of people moved in. She didn't want Willowbrook to become one of those neighborhoods. She decided to take photos. Using her phone, Patricia carefully photographed the moving truck, the new neighbor sitting on his steps, and the boxes scattered around his front yard. She told herself this was for documentation purposes, in case there were problems later. As the afternoon continued, Patricia noticed that some of the other neighbors had come outside to watch the moving process. Mrs. Chen from next door had brought the new neighbor a glass of lemonade. The family with young children from down the street had stopped to say hello while they were out for a walk. This made Patricia even more frustrated. Couldn't these people see what she saw? Couldn't they tell that this man was going to be trouble? Patricia felt like she was the only one with enough sense to be cautious. When evening came and the moving truck finally left, Patricia felt exhausted from her day of watching and worrying. But she also felt vindicated. The moving process had been loud and disruptive, just as she had predicted. The street looked messy with tire marks from the heavy truck. As Patricia got ready for bed, she looked out her window one more time. The new neighbor's house was mostly dark, with just a few lights on downstairs. She wondered what he was doing in there and what his plans were for the neighborhood. Patricia had made up her mind. She was going to keep a close eye on 1247 Oakwood Drive. At the first sign of real trouble, she would be ready to take action. Someone had to protect Willowbrook. And if the other neighbors were too naive to see the potential problems, then Patricia would have to do it herself. She had worked too hard to build a good life in this neighborhood to let it be ruined now. The next morning, Patricia Henderson was up before sunrise, making her coffee and positioning herself at her favorite spot by the living room window. She had barely slept, her mind racing with worry about what her new neighbor might do next. As the sun came up over Willowbrook, Patricia began what she considered her duty, keeping watch over the neighborhood. At 7:30 in the morning, Patricia saw Marcus Williams come outside. He was wearing running clothes and sneakers. Patricia watched as he did some stretching exercises on his front lawn, then jogged down the street and disappeared around the corner. This immediately concerned Patricia. Why was this man running through their neighborhood so early in the morning? Was he checking out the other houses? Was he looking for security weaknesses? Patricia had read articles about criminals who jogged through neighborhoods to plan break-ins. She decided to time how long he was gone. Patricia sat with her phone stopwatch running, checking the minutes tick by. 28 minutes later, Marcus jogged back down Oakwood Drive, breathing hard but looking healthy and happy. He did some more stretching on his lawn, waved to Mrs. Chen, who was getting her newspaper, and went back inside his house. But Patricia saw something sinister in this normal morning routine. In her mind, Marcus had just spent almost half an hour studying their neighborhood. He had probably memorized which houses had security systems, which ones had dogs, and which residents left for work early. Patricia immediately called her friend Margaret to report what she had seen. He was jogging through the whole neighborhood, Patricia said, her voice tense with worry. For almost 30 minutes. That's not normal exercise, Margaret. That's surveillance. Patricia, maybe he just likes to run, Margaret replied. Lots of people jog in the morning. It's good exercise, but why here? Why in our neighborhood? He just moved in yesterday. Normal people would run in a park or on a track, not through residential streets where they don't belong. Margaret sighed. Patricia, he lives here now. This is his neighborhood too. But Patricia wasn't convinced. She spent the morning making notes about Marcus's activities. She wrote down the time he went running, how long he was gone, and which direction he went. She told herself this information might be important later. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus came outside again. This time he was carrying a measuring tape and a notebook. Patricia watched as he walked around his property, measuring different areas and writing things down. To Patricia, this looked highly suspicious. Why did he need to measure everything? Was he planning to build something that would violate neighborhood rules? Was he figuring out property lines so he could cause boundary disputes with his neighbors? Patricia grabbed her phone and started taking pictures. She zoomed in as much as possible, trying to capture Marcus measuring his driveway, his front yard, and the space between his house and the neighbor's fence. She took photos of him writing in his notebook, convinced she was documenting evidence of some kind of scheme. When Marcus walked to the back of his house and disappeared from view, Patricia felt frustrated. What was he doing back there that he didn't want people to see? She considered walking around the block to try to get a view of his backyard, but decided that might be too obvious. Instead, Patricia called Linda, the homeowner association president again. Linda, I need to ask you about the rules regarding property modifications, Patricia said. What kind of modifications? Linda asked. The new neighbor is measuring everything around his house. I think he's planning to build something. Don't we have rules about getting approval before making changes? Well, yes, major changes need approval. But Patricia, he just moved in yesterday. He's probably just trying to learn about his property. Maybe he wants to know where he can plant flowers or put a garden. It looks more serious than that, Patricia insisted. He's writing everything down like he's making plans. I have pictures if you want to see them. Linda was quiet for a moment. Patricia, I think you might be reading too much into this. New homeowners often measure their property. It's normal. After hanging up, Patricia felt like no one was taking her concerns seriously. She decided she needed to gather more evidence before people would listen to her. Around noon, Patricia noticed that Marcus had several visitors. First, a woman in a small car pulled into his driveway. She stayed for about an hour, and Patricia could see through the windows that she and Marcus were walking through the house together. Patricia assumed this was some kind of business meeting, possibly involving illegal activities. Next, a man in a pickup truck arrived. He and Marcus walked around the outside of the house, pointing at different things and having what looked like a serious conversation. The man had a clipboard and seemed to be taking notes. Patricia was convinced this was some kind of planning session for criminal activities. Patricia took pictures of both visitors, making sure to get clear shots of their license plates. She wrote down the times they arrived and left, the descriptions of their vehicles, and notes about what she observed them doing. When the second visitor left, Patricia called the non-emergency police line. I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood, she told the dispatcher. What kind of suspicious activity? The dispatcher asked. My new neighbor has been having meetings with different people all day. They're walking around his property and taking notes. It looks like they're planning something. Ma'am, is it possible these are just contractors or service people? It's normal for new homeowners to have people come look at repairs or improvements. It doesn't look normal to me, Patricia insisted. The whole thing seems very secretive and planned out. The dispatcher took down Patricia's information and told her they would keep the report on file. But Patricia could tell they weren't taking her seriously either. As the afternoon went on, Patricia became more and more agitated. She watched Marcus move boxes from his garage into his house. She saw him set up what looked like exercise equipment in his living room. She observed him talking on his phone while walking around his backyard. Every normal activity looked suspicious to Patricia. When Marcus brought in his mail, she wondered if he was receiving instructions from accomplices. When he watered the roses by his front steps, she thought he might be sending signals to people watching the neighborhood. When he sat on his front porch reading a book, she was convinced he was actually keeping lookout while pretending to read. Patricia's imagination was running wild, and her fear was growing stronger with each passing hour. She had convinced herself that Marcus Williams was not just a bad neighbor, but a dangerous criminal who was planning something terrible for their peaceful community. As evening approached, Patricia realized she had spent the entire day watching and documenting her neighbor's activities. She had pages of notes, dozens of photos, and a growing sense that something bad was about to happen in Willowbrook. That night, Patricia barely slept again. Every sound outside made her jump. Every car that drove down the street made her peek through her curtains. She was becoming obsessed with the idea that Marcus Williams was a threat to everything she held dear about her neighborhood. Patricia had worked herself into a state of panic, and she was ready to take more serious action. On Sunday morning, Patricia Henderson woke up with a sense of dread that had been building for 2 days. She had spent the weekend watching Marcus Williams and documenting what she believed was suspicious behavior. Her notebook was now filled with times, descriptions, and theories about what her new neighbor was really doing in Willowbrook. Patricia made her coffee and took her usual position at the window. It was still early, but she wanted to be ready in case Marcus did something that proved her suspicions were correct. At 8:15, Marcus came outside wearing work clothes and carrying a toolbox. Patricia watched as he walked around to the side of his house where the air conditioning unit was located. He knelt down and began examining the unit, using tools from his toolbox to check different parts. To Patricia, this was the final proof she needed. Marcus was clearly tampering with equipment, possibly planning to disable security systems or cut power to neighboring houses. She had read about criminals who would disable utilities before committing robberies. Patricia's hands were shaking as she picked up her phone. She had been thinking about calling the police for 2 days, but now she felt she had no choice. Something criminal was definitely happening, and she was the only one who could see it. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher answered. I need to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood, Patricia said, her voice tight with fear and anger. What kind of suspicious activity, ma'am? There's a black male who moved into my neighborhood 2 days ago, and he's been acting very suspicious ever since. Right now, he's tampering with equipment behind his house. I think he's planning to commit crimes. The dispatcher was trained to take all calls seriously, but something about Patricia's tone made her ask for more details. Can you describe what you're seeing right now? He's a tall black man, probably in his 50s. He's been walking around the neighborhood, measuring things, having secret meetings with people, and now he's messing with some kind of equipment. I've been watching him for 2 days, and everything he does looks suspicious. Ma'am, you said he moved into the neighborhood. Is this his house? Well, yes, but that doesn't matter. He's clearly up to something. This is a quiet, safe neighborhood, and ever since he moved in, there's been nothing but noise and suspicious activity. The dispatcher made notes on her computer while Patricia continued talking. He was running through the neighborhood yesterday morning, like he was checking out all the houses. Then he had people coming and going all day, taking notes and making plans. And this morning he's outside messing with equipment. I'm telling you, something criminal is about to happen. Ma'am, what's the address where this is happening? 1247 Oakwood Drive, and my name is Patricia Henderson. I live across the street at 1244. I've been a resident of Willowbrook for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Okay, Mrs. Henderson, we'll send an officer to check on the situation. Please hurry, Patricia said. I don't know what he's planning, but I have a really bad feeling about this. After hanging up, Patricia felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She was glad she had finally taken action, but she was also nervous about what might happen next. She continued watching Marcus, who was still working on the air conditioning unit, completely unaware that police were on their way. Patricia went to her kitchen and made another cup of coffee, then returned to her window. She wanted to be able to give the police a full report when they arrived. She looked through her notebook at all the evidence she had gathered over the past 2 days. 20 minutes later, Patricia saw a police car turning onto Oakwood Drive. Her heart started beating faster. This was really happening. The police were going to investigate Marcus Williams and hopefully discover what he was really up to. The police car was a black and white patrol vehicle with "City Police" written on the side. It drove slowly down the street and parked in front of Marcus's house. Patricia watched as 2 officers got out of the car. The first officer was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and moved with confidence. The second officer was a man who looked like he might be Asian American. He was slightly shorter than his partner but had the same professional bearing. Patricia felt vindicated as she watched the officers approach Marcus's house. Finally, someone with authority was going to deal with this situation. She was sure that once the police talked to Marcus and saw his suspicious behavior for themselves, they would understand that she had been right to be concerned. The officers walked up Marcus's driveway, past the boxes and equipment that were still scattered around from his move. Marcus was still working on the air conditioning unit and didn't notice them at first. When Officer Martinez called out, "Excuse me, sir," Marcus looked up from his work. Patricia could see his face clearly from her window, and she thought he looked guilty and nervous. But as Patricia continued watching, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of the confrontation she had been expecting, the conversation between Marcus and the officers seemed to be going differently than she had planned. Marcus stood up and walked over to the officers. Even from across the street, Patricia could see that he was calm and respectful. He wasn't acting like someone who had been caught doing something wrong. He was acting like someone who was simply talking to police officers. The three of them talked for several minutes. Patricia couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see their body language. The officers didn't seem to be treating Marcus like a criminal. They seemed to be having a normal conversation. Then something happened that Patricia couldn't understand. Both officers straightened up and their whole demeanor changed. They seemed to be showing more respect to Marcus, not less. Patricia pressed her face closer to the window, trying to see what was happening. She had expected the officers to handcuff Marcus or at least search his property. Instead, they seemed to be treating him like an honored guest. One of the officers, the woman, was nodding and smiling. The male officer had his hand extended like he was shaking Marcus's hand. Patricia couldn't believe what she was seeing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Patricia had been so sure that the police would see what she saw. She had been certain that once professionals investigated Marcus Williams, they would discover the truth about his suspicious activities. But from her window, it looked like the exact opposite was happening. The police officers seemed to like Marcus. They seemed to respect him, and Patricia couldn't understand why. As she watched in growing confusion and dismay, Patricia realized that her plan to expose Marcus Williams was not working the way she had expected. Instead of proving that he was a criminal, she might have just made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to take back the phone call. The police were there, and whatever was going to happen next was completely out of Patricia's control. Officers Sarah Martinez and James Chen had been partners for 3 years, and they had responded to hundreds of calls during that time. As they drove toward Oakwood Drive, they discussed what they might find when they arrived. "Another suspicious person call," Officer Martinez said, checking the notes on her computer. "The caller seems pretty worked up about her new neighbor." "Yeah, I noticed that too," Officer Chen replied. "She used a lot of loaded language in her description. We'll need to be careful about how we handle this." Both officers were experienced enough to know that not all 911 calls were what they seemed to be. Sometimes people called the police because they were genuinely concerned about criminal activity. Other times people called because they were uncomfortable with change or because they had prejudices they couldn't admit to themselves. When they turned onto Oakwood Drive, both officers immediately noticed how peaceful and well-maintained the neighborhood was. The houses were large and expensive-looking. The lawns were perfectly maintained. This didn't look like the kind of area where serious crimes usually happened. They parked in front of 1247 Oakwood Drive and got out of their patrol car. The house looked normal. There were some moving boxes still stacked by the garage, and the lawn had some tire marks from the moving truck, but nothing seemed out of place or threatening. Officer Martinez spotted a man working on an air conditioning unit on the side of the house. He was wearing work clothes and using tools that looked appropriate for the job. This matched the caller's description of someone tampering with equipment, but it looked like normal home maintenance to both officers. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Martinez called out as they approached. The man looked up from his work and stood to face them. Both officers immediately noticed several things about him. He was tall and fit, probably in his early 50s. His posture was straight and confident. When he looked at them, his eyes were direct and respectful, not nervous or evasive. "Good morning, officers," Marcus said calmly. "Is there something I can help you with?" Officer Chen was struck by the man's tone of voice. He spoke clearly and respectfully, with the kind of confidence that came from someone who was comfortable dealing with authority figures. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the neighborhood," Officer Martinez explained. The caller was concerned about activity at this address. "I'm Officer Martinez, and this is my partner, Officer Chen." "I'm Marcus Williams," he replied, extending his hand to shake hands with both officers. "I just moved in 2 days ago. Is there a specific problem I can help you with?" Both officers shook his hand and immediately noticed his firm, confident grip. This wasn't the handshake of someone who was nervous about talking to police. The caller mentioned that you've been measuring things around your property and having meetings with various people. Officer Chen said, "Can you tell us about that?" Marcus smiled and gestured toward his house. "I just bought this place after retiring from the military. I've been measuring spaces because I want to plan some improvements. Yesterday I had visits from a real estate agent who helped with the closing paperwork, and a contractor who's going to give me an estimate on updating the kitchen." Officer Martinez nodded. This explanation made perfect sense and matched what they had observed from normal new homeowner activities. The caller also mentioned that you've been jogging through the neighborhood. She said, "That's right," Marcus replied. "I try to run every morning. It's a habit I developed during my military career. I thought it would be a good way to learn the layout of my new neighborhood and stay in shape." Officer Chen picked up on Marcus's mention of military service. As a former Marine himself, he recognized something familiar in Marcus's bearing and way of speaking. "What branch of the military were you in?" Officer Chen asked. "Army," Marcus replied. "I just retired after 25 years of service." "Thank you for your service," both officers said almost simultaneously. "And thank you for yours," Marcus replied, looking at Officer Chen. "Marine?" "Yes, sir." "How did you know?" Marcus smiled. "You carry yourself like a Marine. Once you've served, you can usually spot it in others." The conversation was taking on a completely different tone than either officer had expected when they received the call. Instead of investigating suspicious activity, they were talking to a fellow veteran who seemed to be doing exactly what any normal person would do when moving into a new home. "What was your rank when you retired?" Officer Martinez asked. "Colonel," Marcus replied simply. Both officers felt their respect for Marcus increase immediately. They knew that reaching the rank of colonel required exceptional leadership skills, dedication, and character. "May I ask what you did in the Army?" Officer Chen inquired. "I spent most of my career in logistics and personnel management. I did 3 tours overseas, mostly making sure that troops had what they needed and got home safely." Officer Martinez was beginning to understand how wrong the 911 call had been. The caller had described Marcus as suspicious and potentially dangerous. But both officers were now talking to someone who had spent 25 years serving his country and protecting others. "Sir, would you mind if we asked to see some identification?" Officer Chen requested. "It's just standard procedure for these types of calls." "Of course," Marcus replied without hesitation. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, removing his driver's license and military ID card. Officer Martinez examined the documents while Officer Chen continued the conversation. The caller mentioned that you were working on some kind of equipment this morning. Was that the air conditioning unit? "That's right," Marcus said. "The unit wasn't cooling properly, so I was checking to see if it was a simple problem I could fix myself or if I needed to call a repair service. I learned basic mechanical skills in the Army." Everything Marcus said made perfect sense. Both officers realized they were dealing with a situation where a nervous neighbor had misinterpreted completely normal activities. Officer Martinez handed Marcus's identification back to him. As she did, she noticed the name more carefully and felt a spark of recognition. "Colonel Marcus Williams," she said slowly. "Were you involved in Operation Desert Shield?" Marcus looked surprised. "Yes, I was." "How did you know that?" "I think I recognize your name from some military publications my father used to read. He was Army too, and he used to tell me stories about different missions and the people who led them." Officer Chen was also looking at Marcus with new interest. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, did you receive any special commendations during your service?" Marcus seemed modest about answering. "I was fortunate to serve with some exceptional people and to be in positions where I could make a difference." But both officers could tell there was more to the story. They had dealt with enough military personnel to know that someone who reached the rank of colonel and served multiple tours overseas had almost certainly done things worthy of recognition. The situation had completely transformed from what either officer had expected when they responded to the call. Instead of investigating a suspicious person, they were now talking to a decorated military veteran who had clearly devoted his life to serving others. Both officers were beginning to realize that they owed Marcus Williams an apology, and that the person who had called 911 owed him much more than that. Officer Chen excused himself for a moment and walked back toward the patrol car to run Marcus Williams's information through the police database. This was standard procedure, but Chen also had a growing suspicion that there was much more to Marcus's military service than the modest colonel was letting on. While Chen was checking the database, Officer Martinez continued talking with Marcus about his transition to civilian life and his plans for the house. She found him to be thoughtful, articulate, and genuinely friendly. Nothing about his behavior suggested he was the kind of person who would cause problems in any neighborhood. "Colonel Williams," Martinez said, "I have to ask you something directly. The person who called us seemed very concerned about your activities over the past couple of days. Have you noticed anyone watching you or acting strangely toward you?" Marcus sighed and looked across the street toward Patricia Henderson's house. "I did notice a woman at the window across the street who seemed to be paying a lot of attention to what I was doing. I thought about going over to introduce myself, but I didn't want to intrude. I figured she was just curious about the new neighbor." "That would be Mrs. Henderson," Martinez said. "She's the one who called us." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that people can be nervous about change. I was hoping that once I got settled in, I could meet my neighbors properly and maybe address any concerns they might have." Martinez was impressed by Marcus's calm and understanding response. Many people would have been angry about having the police called on them for doing normal activities around their own home, but Marcus seemed to genuinely care about building good relationships with his neighbors. Officer Chen returned from the patrol car with a serious expression on his face. He approached Marcus and Martinez with what looked like official paperwork in his hand. "Colonel Williams," Chen said formally, "I need to apologize. We ran your information through our system, and some additional details came up about your military service." Marcus looked curious but not concerned. "What kind of details?" Chen looked down at the papers in his hand, then back up at Marcus with obvious respect. "Sir, it says here that you received the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Distinguished Service Medal, among other commendations." Marcus seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "I was fortunate to serve with exceptional people in challenging situations. Report mentioned something about a mission in Afghanistan, where you led a rescue operation that saved over 40 civilians from a terrorist attack," Chen continued. "It says you risked your own life to coordinate the evacuation while under enemy fire." Officer Martinez felt her jaw drop. She was looking at a genuine war hero, someone who had literally risked his life to save others. The contrast between Marcus's heroic service record and Mrs. Henderson's suspicious phone call was becoming more stark by the minute. "Sir," Chen continued, "the database also shows that you received commendations for your work training and mentoring young soldiers, and for improving safety protocols that prevented casualties. Your commanding officer's reports describe you as one of the most effective and respected leaders they ever worked with." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Those reports were written by people who were being generous. "I was just doing my job." But both officers could see that Marcus was being modest about achievements that were truly extraordinary. They were realizing that they were in the presence of someone who had devoted his entire adult life to protecting and serving others, often at great personal risk. "Colonel Williams," Officer Martinez said, "I need to be completely honest with you. Mrs. Henderson called us because she was suspicious about your activities since you moved in. She thought you might be planning criminal activity." Marcus looked surprised but not angry. "Criminal activity? What did she think I was doing?" "She was concerned about you jogging through the neighborhood, measuring your property, meeting with contractors, and working on your air conditioning unit," Chen explained. She interpreted these normal activities as suspicious behavior. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Both officers could see that he was thinking carefully about how to respond. "I'm sorry that my presence has made Mrs. Henderson uncomfortable," Marcus finally said. "That was never my intention. Is there something I can do to address her concerns?" Martinez and Chen exchanged glances. They were both thinking the same thing. Most people would be angry about being falsely accused of criminal activity, but Marcus was concerned about his neighbor's feelings and wanted to make things right. "Sir, to be honest, I think the problem is Mrs. Henderson's, not yours," Officer Martinez said. "You've done nothing wrong. You've been doing exactly what any new homeowner would do." Chen nodded in agreement. "Colonel, we've been police officers for several years and we've learned to spot genuine suspicious behavior. What you've been doing is completely normal. Mrs. Henderson seems to have let her imagination run away with her." Marcus looked thoughtful. "I've dealt with similar situations during my military career. Sometimes when people are afraid or uncertain, they can misinterpret normal actions as threatening. Usually the best solution is communication and patience." Both officers were impressed by Marcus's wisdom and maturity. Even after being falsely accused of criminal activity, he was approaching the situation with understanding and a desire to find a peaceful solution. "Colonel Williams," Chen said, "I want you to know that both Officer Martinez and I are veterans ourselves. We have tremendous respect for your service record and for the way you've handled this situation today." "That means a lot to me," Marcus replied. "The military taught me that we're all stronger when we work together and treat each other with respect." Officer Martinez realized that this situation was about to become a teaching moment for the entire neighborhood. Word would spread quickly that the police had been called on a decorated war hero who was simply trying to settle into his new home. "Sir, would you be willing to let us apologize to you formally?" Chen asked. "You shouldn't have had to deal with this kind of suspicion when you're just trying to start a new chapter in your life." Marcus smiled. "Officers, I appreciate that, but it's not necessary. You were just doing your job. Mrs. Henderson was concerned about her neighborhood and she called the people she thought could help. That's actually what good citizens are supposed to do." Both officers were amazed by Marcus's grace and understanding. Even in a situation where he had every right to be upset, he was focused on seeing the best in people and finding positive solutions. But Chen and Martinez knew that Marcus Williams deserved more than just an apology. They knew that he deserved the recognition and respect that his service had earned him. They looked at each other and nodded. They had both come to the same conclusion about what needed to happen next. Officer Chen and Officer Martinez exchanged a meaningful look. They had both served in the military and they knew that what they were about to do was not just appropriate, but necessary. Marcus Williams deserved recognition for his service, especially in this moment when he had been wrongly accused and treated with suspicion. "Colonel Williams," Officer Chen said, his voice becoming more formal and respectful, "would you permit us to honor your service properly?" Marcus looked confused. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" Without another word, both officers stepped back and came to attention. Their posture became perfectly straight, their faces serious and respectful. Then, in perfect unison, they raised their right hands to their foreheads in a crisp military salute. "Thank you for your service to our country, sir," Officer Martinez said clearly. Marcus was clearly surprised and moved by this gesture. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then his own military training took over, and he straightened his posture and returned their salute with the precision of someone who had done it thousands of times during his career. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "It was an honor to serve." The three of them held the salute for several seconds, a moment of respect and recognition that acknowledged Marcus's sacrifices and achievements. When they finally lowered their hands, the atmosphere had changed, completely from the suspicious investigation that had brought the officers to Oakwood Drive. What none of them realized was that their exchange was being witnessed by several neighbors who had been drawn outside by the presence of the police car. Mrs. Chen from next door had come out to water her flowers and was watching from her front yard. The family with young children from down the street had been walking their dog and had stopped to see what was happening. Even some neighbors from the next block had noticed the police car and wandered over to investigate. Patricia Henderson was still watching from her window, but now her face showed confusion and growing dismay instead of vindication. This was not what she had expected to happen when she called the police. Mrs. Chen was the first neighbor to approach the group. She was an elderly Korean woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, and she had been planning to welcome Marcus properly once he got settled in. "Excuse me," Mrs. Chen said politely. "Is everything all right here?" Officer Martinez turned to address her. Everything is fine, ma'am. We were just meeting your new neighbor, Colonel Williams. Colonel? Mrs. Chen repeated, looking at Marcus with new interest. I'm retired Army, Marcus explained. Just moved in a couple of days ago. Mrs. Chen smiled broadly. Well, it's wonderful to meet you, Colonel Williams. Thank you for your service. My late husband was a veteran too. By now, more neighbors had gathered around. The word colonel was being passed from person to person, and people were beginning to understand that something significant was happening. Officer Chen decided to address the growing crowd. Folks, we want you to know that Colonel Williams here is a decorated war hero who just retired after 25 years of service to our country. He received the Silver Star for saving over 40 civilians in Afghanistan. A murmur of respect and admiration went through the group of neighbors. Several people began applauding and others called out, "Thank you for your service." Marcus seemed overwhelmed by the positive response. Thank you all very much. I'm looking forward to being part of this community. The family with the young children stepped forward. The father extended his hand to Marcus. I'm Tom Bradley, and this is my wife Sarah and our kids Emma and Michael. We live at the end of the street. It's an honor to have you as a neighbor. The honor is mine, Marcus replied, shaking hands with Tom and Sarah and kneeling down to say hello to the children. More neighbors continued to introduce themselves and thank Marcus for his service. The atmosphere was becoming celebratory rather than suspicious. People were asking about his military career, welcoming him to the neighborhood, and offering to help him get settled. Officer Martinez looked across the street and saw Patricia Henderson still standing at her window. The officer made a decision to address the situation directly. Excuse me, Martinez called out loudly enough for Patricia to hear. Mrs. Henderson, could you come outside for a moment? Patricia hesitated, clearly not wanting to face the crowd that had gathered. But she knew she couldn't hide inside forever, so she reluctantly came outside and walked across the street. When she reached the group, Officer Chen addressed her directly. Mrs. Henderson, we've completed our investigation of your complaint. We found no suspicious activity whatsoever. Colonel Williams has been doing normal homeowner activities since moving into his new house. Patricia's face was red with embarrassment. She looked around at all the neighbors who were now staring at her, and she realized that everyone understood what had really happened. Mrs. Henderson, Officer Martinez continued, Colonel Williams is a decorated war hero who risked his life to save civilians overseas. He served our country with distinction for 25 years. There was absolutely no basis for your concerns about criminal activity. The crowd of neighbors was now looking at Patricia, with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. She had called the police on a man who had served his country heroically, simply because she was uncomfortable with having a black neighbor. Mrs. Chen stepped forward and addressed Patricia directly. Patricia, I think you owe Colonel Williams an apology. Several other neighbors nodded in agreement. Patricia was faced with a choice. She could apologize and try to make things right, or she could continue to defend her actions and face the judgment of her entire neighborhood. Marcus, however, stepped in before Patricia had to respond. Mrs. Henderson, I understand that change can be unsettling. I hope that as we get to know each other, any concerns you might have will be resolved. I'm committed to being a good neighbor to everyone in this community. His gracious response made Patricia's prejudiced phone call look even worse by comparison. Marcus was offering forgiveness and understanding to someone who had treated him with suspicion and hostility. Officer Chen addressed the crowd one final time. Colonel Williams has handled this situation with the same grace and dignity that marked his military career. This neighborhood is lucky to have him as a resident. The neighbors applauded again, and several people invited Marcus to neighborhood barbecues and community events. What had started as a suspicious person call had turned into an impromptu welcome celebration for a genuine American hero. As the crowd began to disperse, Patricia Henderson found herself alone with the consequences of her actions. Her prejudice had been exposed in front of the entire neighborhood, and she had embarrassed herself by calling the police on someone who deserved respect and gratitude, not suspicion. The tables had turned completely, and Patricia realized that she was now the one who was being judged by her neighbors. As the crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, each person made a point of shaking hands with Marcus Williams and expressing their appreciation for his service. Children who had been playing nearby came over with their parents to meet the new neighbor who was apparently a real hero. The whole scene had transformed from a police investigation into a neighborhood welcome party. Officers Martinez and Chen prepared to leave, but before they got in their patrol car, Officer Chen approached Marcus one more time. "Colonel Williams, I want to give you my card," Chen said. "If you ever have any problems in this neighborhood, any problems at all, please don't hesitate to call me directly." Marcus accepted the card gratefully. "Thank you, Officer Chen. I hope that won't be necessary, but I appreciate the gesture." "Sir, I meant what I said earlier about your service record," Chen continued. "What you did in Afghanistan was extraordinary. 40 families have their loved ones home because of your courage and leadership." Marcus nodded humbly. "I was just doing what any soldier would do in that situation." "No, sir, you weren't," Officer Martinez interjected. "I've read reports about that mission since we ran your information. What you did went far beyond the call of duty. You stayed behind to coordinate the evacuation while your own unit was taking heavy fire. You saved lives at the risk of your own." As the officers drove away, Marcus found himself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to continue welcoming him to Willowbrook. Mrs. Chen invited him over for dinner the following evening. The Bradley family asked if he would like to join their weekly barbecues. An elderly man named Mr. Peterson, who turned out to be a Vietnam veteran, struck up a conversation about their shared military experiences. Patricia Henderson, meanwhile, had retreated to her house and was watching from her window again. But this time, instead of looking for suspicious activity, she was watching Marcus interact with the other neighbors and seeing the genuine warmth and respect they were showing him. Over the next several hours, the story of what had happened spread throughout the Willowbrook community. People who hadn't been present for the officer's salute heard about it from their neighbors. The story became a topic of conversation at dinner tables throughout the neighborhood. Some residents were embarrassed that one of their neighbors had called the police on a war hero. Others were angry about the prejudice that Patricia had shown. But most people were simply grateful to learn that they had such an exceptional person living among them. Marcus spent the rest of Sunday afternoon unpacking boxes and setting up his house, but he was frequently interrupted by neighbors stopping by to introduce themselves. Each visitor brought something: fresh-baked cookies, a potted plant for his garden, or simply an offer to help with anything he might need. By evening, Marcus had met more neighbors in one day than he had expected to meet in his first month. His kitchen counter was covered with welcome gifts, and his phone had several new contacts from people who wanted to stay in touch. That night, as Marcus sat on his front porch reading a book, he reflected on the strange turn his weekend had taken. He had expected some adjustment period as he got used to civilian life and a new community. He had not expected to have the police called on him for doing normal homeowner activities. But Marcus had learned long ago that life rarely went according to plan. His military career had taught him to adapt to unexpected situations and to find the positive in challenging circumstances. The incident with Mrs. Henderson had been unpleasant, but it had also introduced him to neighbors who seemed genuinely welcoming and kind. Across the street, Patricia Henderson was having a very different evening. She had spent the day alone in her house, avoiding contact with anyone in the neighborhood. She knew that word had spread about her phone call to the police, and she was ashamed of how the situation had turned out. Patricia was beginning to understand that her suspicions about Marcus had been based on prejudice rather than facts. She had seen a black man moving into her neighborhood and had immediately assumed he was a threat. She had interpreted normal activities as suspicious, simply because they were being done by someone who looked different from her. As the days passed, Patricia watched Marcus Williams become integrated into the neighborhood community. She saw him jogging each morning, and now she realized he was just exercising, not surveying the area for criminal activity. She saw him working in his yard, and she understood he was taking care of his property, not planning something sinister. More importantly, Patricia saw how the other neighbors treated Marcus. Children played in his yard while he worked in his garden. Neighbors stopped to chat when they walked by his house. Mrs. Chen brought him vegetables from her garden, and he reciprocated by helping her with heavy lifting tasks. Marcus never mentioned Patricia's phone call to the other neighbors, even though everyone knew what had happened. He never treated her with hostility, or tried to make her feel unwelcome in her own neighborhood. When they passed each other on the street, Marcus always nodded politely, just as he did with all his neighbors. 3 weeks after the incident, Patricia finally worked up the courage to approach Marcus directly. She found him one evening as he was watering the roses by his front steps. "Colonel Williams," she said nervously, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus turned off his hose and gave her his full attention. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson, what can I do for you?" Patricia had practiced what she wanted to say, but now that she was face to face with Marcus, the words came out awkwardly. "I wanted to apologize for calling the police on you. I realize now that I was wrong, and I'm sorry for the trouble I caused." Marcus listened carefully before responding. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your apology. I understand that having new neighbors can be an adjustment." "It wasn't about you being a new neighbor," Patricia said, forcing herself to be honest. "It was about my own prejudices. I made assumptions about you based on your race, and that was wrong." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for being honest about that. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes." "I've been watching how you interact with the other neighbors," Patricia continued. "I can see that you're a good person and a good neighbor. I'm embarrassed about how I acted." "Mrs. Henderson, we all have room to grow and learn," Marcus replied gently. "What matters is that we're willing to acknowledge our mistakes and do better in the future." Their conversation marked a turning point, not just for Patricia, but for the entire neighborhood. Word spread that Patricia had apologized to Marcus, and people began to see that real change was possible when people were willing to confront their own prejudices honestly. 6 months later, Marcus Williams had become one of the most respected and beloved residents of Willowbrook. He organized a neighborhood watch program, helped elderly residents with yard work, and mentored young people who were considering military service. Patricia Henderson, meanwhile, had begun volunteering with a local organization that worked to promote understanding between different racial and ethnic communities. She often spoke about her experience with Marcus as an example of how prejudice could be overcome through honest self-reflection and genuine human connection. The story of what happened on Oakwood Drive became a powerful reminder for the entire community about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. It showed that assumptions based on race or appearance were not only wrong, but could blind people to the exceptional qualities and contributions of their neighbors. Most importantly, it demonstrated that even when prejudice creates division and mistrust, it is possible to build bridges of understanding when people are willing to see each other as fellow human beings, deserving of respect and honor.